Welcome everybody to this webinar on moving beyond Western discourse frameworks for climate ethics. The first speaker is Bayo Akomolafe. He is from Nigeria, he lives in India, and he is one of those soft-spoken but very critical people who think deeply, more than most other people, about the way other people think. And he has a very critical position on the way Western thinking works and how it brought us to this point of crisis for the planet. Bayo.
Thank you, Andreas. There's something uniquely calming about your voice. I don't know if anyone has told you so. Just brings me into the room. So thank you. I would like to use the tiny space of time that I have to consider a question that feels central to our gathering here. And the question is, what is missing in the Euro-American machine of responsivity to the climate crisis? What is missing? And that question, of course, sprouts from a consideration that over time, through the legacies of climate change conferences and legislation, it seems we are stacking up failure upon failure upon failure. That is not to dismiss or to invisibilize the many considerable measures that have been taken that might be said to move the conversation forward, right? But there is a sense in which a popular appraisal is that since the 70s, since global warming, climate change became a thing, we are failing. We are not responding in the radically, intergenerationally radical ways that we possibly can to this incalculable crisis. So I want to just stay with that question for a bit. Many of us know that the Glasgow event ended some time ago recently. And I want to just call out two events about something that related to that event, just things that happened there that might help us think with what I would like to say. There was a gathering within the conference in Glasgow where Nancy Pelosi from the US was addressing questions from reporters. The final question she gave to a woman. She specifically said, I'd like a woman to respond. The clip is on YouTube. And then I think she took back her words, like maybe not a woman, but I digress. Abby Martins from the Empire Files stands up and basically asks that why, or she frames it this way, that how could you claim to be committed to climate, justice, if there is a bipartisan consensus for increasing the budget of the Pentagon? May I remind you that the Pentagon and Washington is exempt from the conversations, and yet the Pentagon contributes to warming more than 140 countries combined. So how could you speak about, justice and commitment if this is going on at the same time? Needless to say, the response wasn't coherent or convincing. It basically amounted to, well, increasing the budget of the military is not inconsistent with a commitment to climate justice, but no one really believed that. That's the first event. The second one was at the end, and the Secretary, Alok Sharma, said to be almost in tears as they were wrapping up the text and the policies and the language that all the nations were supposed to adhere to. And then something happened. India, where I happen to be at the moment, advocated for the change in language. And so it was no longer in terms of reducing carbon, coal dependency. It was no longer phase out, it was phase down. And many nations and their delegates protested this. Apparently the US and China were also behind this, and they supported this move. and it was closed. It closed that way. So that in a sense, and this is what some journalist in The Guardian, I cannot remember the person's name right now, argues is testament to the failure, because the whole purpose of Glasgow was to try and meet the goals of Paris, to try to move things to 1.5 Celsius degrees in terms of temperature shifts, and to try to reduce on coal dependency. And nations couldn't agree to that. So my question then is, why this repeated failure? What intensity, what socio-materialities are in the field that keep us incarcerated, anchored to this almost repetitive cycle, this toxic cyclicity of passivity, of doing the same things over and over again? A diplomat wrote to me and said, I was in the room, and people are saying, well, we look forward to COP27. So it seems we're just in this automatic gear of doing the same things over and over again. My question is why? I theorize that we are stuck, especially the Euro-American machine of responsibility, that we're stuck, that we are embedded in networks of deep fidelity to the normal, to the familiar, in the ways that we meet each other, in the ways that we frame well-being, in the ways that we understand the self, in the ways that we understand the environment, in the ways that we understand nature. We are stuck in a cosmovision that dooms us in a way to repeat what we're doing. That's not to say that there aren't solutions, but I do not think that we will arrive intact, that it will demand a radical undoing of what it means to be human. So let me theorize further a bit. I think, and maybe I should frame this in terms of a what if question. What if the intractability of climate change is climate change? Not just that, the climate is erratic weather patterns. What if our inability to meet this moment, and by we here, I'm limiting it to the Euro-American machine, right? What if that response is part of climate change? Not just the things outside our windows. What if those conferences, those meetings, the last minute shifts, what if those are symptoms of our stuckness, right? What if the anthropos, what we call the human, which is not just the anthropological figure, which is not just the handsome figure of Andreas on my screen, but a colonial territorial way of acting? What if that is wanting to stop, wanting to meet its end? What if we've met something so incalculable in its hyper reality that it is demanding something else entirely, almost infiltrating the very notion of human agency and our ability to do things, and inviting something else to spill from that container? I feel that this thing we call the human, this way of acting, this thing that stretches back, all the way back, and I hate to use the language of back and forth as if time is linear, but this thing that claims a world-building project, a posture of rectilinearity, the idea that we are the ones in charge, that humans will save the day, eventually, given political will and funding and coalition building, we will eventually come across technologies to solve this problem. What if that is being undone by the world, by the non-human, by the interruption of what Deleuze would call thought? And what if this human desires the animal? By the animal, I mean what some anthropologists might refer to as animism, a different cosmo-perception altogether that does not centralize humans and what they can do, but actually limits us and asks us to focus or notice or co-create technologies of humility, technologies of composting our edges, so that we're able to understand that the world is agential, intelligent, and alive, and we are not the agents in the room. We are not the central operators. I feel, to that poll question, which is very interesting, I feel that the moral technologies and moral architectures that we're framing every time, you can call them technologies of righteousness. When we speak about what we should do and that we should do things might be part of the problem. And that at this time, it's almost as if the world, post-human, more than human in its agency, is asking us to stop. You might revolt and say, stop, we have to do something. But maybe that's the point. Our doing something, we don't just do things, we do things with, right? Doing is always ecological, always cybernetic, always assemblage-like. We are doing things with enlightenment thinking. We're doing things with a mechanical thinking, with Cartesian paradigms. We're still thinking that if only we can tweak it long enough, we will march out of this swamp and sing Kumbaya. Well, maybe that's the issue here, that we need to come down to earth, and that agency itself is being beleaguered, is being called out. Agency is being upbraided, is being disciplined by a world that has always exceeded the modern human.
Personally, I find it disturbing. I am culturally a product of enlightenment. And in the European Union, that is one of the philosophical foundations of what we regard as a good society. So I'm disturbed by the fact that you list enlightenment amongst the words that limit our Western thinking to always find the wrong solution to the problems that we've defined. Could you elaborate a little bit about what is the problem of enlightenment?
Enlightenment owes its legacies and genealogy to the idea that the world can be reduced to the human. Basically, it centralizes the human as the operative center of everything that is good and worthy and intelligent. So it's all about us, so to speak. We banished, in a sense, or Western history banished the sacred. Western history banished the gods, right, and the archetypes. But like James Hillman would say, who is supposedly the founder of archetypal psychology, I don't think he would agree with that designation. The gods never really left, right? And so this is a blind spot for enlightenment. It's not that enlightenment is wrong or is evil. It's just a particular technology that invests in particular ways. And as a result of those investments, invisibilizes an entire world that has always been the condition for its superiority, right? So it's just the same way that we say that modernity was built on the back of the slave ship. In that same way, I think what we call climate change, what we rudely call climate change, is the insurgency of the invisible. We are now turning to those things that have been the conditions for progress and development. And now we can no longer continue forward with some kind of unbothered mastery. I think this is the time to unlearn mastery.
Thank you very much, Bayo, for this. I think it introduced us to the critical thinking we want to have here as we reflect on the Western discourse and try to get new framings for the climate ethics. It's the critical distance and the outside perspective that you provided. Thank you. Wolfgang Kaleck, our next speaker, he is a lawyer and all the human rights lawyer, constitutional lawyer, criminal lawyer who's worked for people you wouldn't want to meet, and he has also defended people that you would like to meet. He has been all over the place, and he has the critical distance. He comes from Berlin, he lives in Berlin, so he is an insider, but he has the critical distance also to our Western way of organizing our governments, our society through rules. As a lawyer, he does.
Thank you very much, Andreas and Eva, for inviting me, and thanks to Bayo for setting the stage. Bayo, I think I let stand what you had been saying alone, and I would like to add some further aspects. And surprise, surprise, these further aspects actually have to do with your question, Bayo. What is missing in the Euro-American scene regarding climate change. And I would like to have three aspects covered. One is a critical reflection of law in general and of human rights law in particular. And I also want to, I have some words regarding the role of civil society actors. Why are we failing? In which regard are we failing, Bayo? I think because since centuries, more people than necessary are dying and are dying too early. And what we also observe since decades is a growing destruction of the nature. And this is not only due to climate change. And that is something I want to insist in, that we are facing an intersectional multiple global crisis. And that includes economic crisis, a growing social injustice, growing authoritarianism, lately the pandemic, and also the climate crisis. So these crises have to be seen at once. And so it's, I think it's and I come back to that. It's a temptation, and it's a wrong temptation to focus only on some of the crises, because we have to tackle them all. So this sounds rather dystopian. Obviously, this conglomeration of global multiple crises, but there is also resistance all over the place, globally, locally, and that includes also, and I will come back to that, legal resistance, use of law, progressive use of law, and that is for what my organization, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin, stands. So we are, yes, we're trying to argue for the prosecution of those who are torturing and committing war crimes, not only the usual suspects from Latin America, but also the CIA torturers. We are also looking very much into corporate accountability and into the human rights violation at European external borders, trying to enforce the right to rights of migrants. So that's more or less where I come from. So it's for us, it's a an ongoing discourse about international law and human rights law, which I'm somehow missing in the climate change movement, because for many in the climate change movement, including state actors, but also non-state actors, they have a kind of naive vision of international law. While I would say talking about international law is talking about the history of imperialism and colonialism, and that is what Anthony Angie, in this wonderful book, Imperialism, Sovereignty, and Making of International Law, points out in many details. So when we look into the big, some of the big dates, the French Revolution, nobody thought of freeing the colonies and abolishing slavery and the slaves in 1789, as well as in 1945, after having defeated the Nazis in 1948, the date of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But while at the same time they claimed to enforce universal rights, those who made the declaration, who were part of the establishers of the declaration, insisted that they might not only keep their colonies, but also contest decolonization and fight decolonial movement, independence movements with tools which at the same time they condemn. So the history of international law, the history of human rights law has its dark sides, including the infamous quote of the Minister of Colonialism in Great Britain, Creech Jones, called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a source of embarrassment. There is a critique of international law, of human rights law, and a claim to decolonize international and human rights law since many years. And that decolonizing human rights law includes decolonize the practice of human rights law and the practice of Western human rights organizations. And that is what post-colonial theorists like Makau Mutwa are arguing for since a very long time. So they would insist that Western human rights organizations behave still in the continuation of this civilizing mission of the colonial times, bringing themselves into the play as saviors, because they reserve this role for them. So it's what he calls the savages, that's the perpetrators, the victims, that's another group within the global south, and saviors paradigm, savages, victims, saviors. And this sounds a little bit like what we're hearing right now when we listen to political leaders and also to environmentalists when they talk, for example, about Brazil, a country like Brazil. We have to, the savages are the Bolsonaros, and there are some victims over there, and we have to come in as saviors, and the civilizing mission this time is an environmental vision. So that is not, I mean, we have to be critical, we have to be reflecting this history of international and of human rights law, but we can also see there is obviously a huge potential of human rights law, and there is also a huge potential for universal principles and declarations like 1789 and 1945. Just to mention two, in 1789, it was not foreseen by the French revolutionaries that Haiti becomes independent a couple of years later, and Olympe de Gouges and other women fight for women's rights, referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And something similar happened after 1945. We have to bear in mind that not only the political and civil rights are enshrined in the Universal Declaration and in many other conventions, but also economic, social, and cultural rights, which should come into place when we talk about the climate change. And we have to see that a number of fairly new fora and also many groups of different actors are now working with international law and with human rights law. And that's a development which started basically in the late 90s, the arrest of Augusto Pinochet, but then also in the 2000s until now, a growing movement, a global Southern movement, but also a Western movement addressing corporate accountability all over the world, attacking mining companies and other corporations which are destroying the nature. And that was a while ago, and I have to remind all of us, that was the fight of environmentalists in Brazil or in Mexico or in India started a while before Western actors discovered the necessity to attack the climate change and to challenge the ongoing destruction of the nature. So it's a common topic for many global Southern actors, although they are not as prominent in the discussion. So why human rights should play a role in climate change? And I would say there are at least two main answers to that. And one is given by Philip Alston, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who released this wonderful report on climate change and poverty in 2019, where he points out the following thing, that, I mean, while many of the Western voices discussing climate change point out the upcoming danger for future generation, there are millions of people already suffering from the destructions of the nature in their respected countries and regions. So people are already dying, and those who will be most affected are not living in our countries, in the global north, but are living in the global south. So that's the one thing. He said that we are facing a period of climate apartheid, which I think is a very catchy phrase. And he and others point also out that any kind of so-called solution for the climate change has to take into account the social questions and it means has to tackle social injustice, has to tackle the economic crisis, which is obviously connected to the structure of the current world economic capitalist system. We can go deeper into that in the discussion. And the second answer why human rights come into play, I would quote a friend of mine, Joshua Castellino, who wrote in a recent article, which is really worth read: Colonial Crime, Environmental Destructions, and Indigenous People: Roadmap to Accountability and Protection. So I quote him, he says, the very beginning, the contemporary climate emergency is directly traceable to colonial activities commenced on indigenous territories, continued under post-colonial regimes with the active support, material and logistic, of the former colonial powers. And so he encouraged us to think historically. And I think that's for solutions, for proposals, which we as civil society actors can enforce, an incredible, interesting approach, because it allows us at the same time to, let's say, I'm not saying enlighten the people, but inform the people. And so what we have to inform the people about is who has caused this mess, who bears the main responsibility for the state of the world, and that is Western states, and that is also numerous companies who profited from the exploitation of men, women, and nature. And that brings us to the next question. The question is, who has to pay for this mess? And the interesting thing is that Joshua Castellino and others raises the question of combining the claim for reparation for colonial crimes, for historical colonial crimes, with the question of subsidizing or kind of contributing to senseful social solutions to tackle the climate change. Means if Western states and companies pay for what they have cost, this money can be used to build up a social adequate political approaches towards the climate change. This is what I wanted to throw into the round, probably with one additional point, and that is it's as important it is to think of individual changes of behavior. I would also agree to those. This is let's say this is a kind of self-affirmation of middle-class Western people who don't dare to tackle those who really have the power and who really use their power in the past and in the present to destroy the world. And that is mainly corporate actors. And so I don't want to talk a lot about Germany and the upcoming government, but a government who at the same time claims that it wants to tackle climate change and also says that it wants to do it hand in hand with business, the same business who contributed and contributes to climate change, there is definitely something wrong. So that is what I wanted to give as a very first remark.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for this tour de force and analysis, not only of thinking and the system of the law, but also the political courage to do things. And just as I was disturbed by some aspects of what Bayo said, I'm also disturbed by some of the aspects that you said, Wolfgang, because if we as NGOs, as activists from the global north or with our Western thinking, don't go after the corporations that are doing harm in the world, throughout the world, then who can we expect to actually stand up to them? There is an open question to me of who could respond if we don't do it. So who is then responsible, and what does it mean for the responsibility that we who are nationals of the nations that created colonialism, created the economic system, created the legal system, that the responsibility that we have inherited by the fact that we are of these nations. So I don't know whether you want to respond. We already have a few questions that have been put by members of the audience through the question and answer session.
The question is, what is the role of economic systems, especially capitalism, in international law? Does it carry forward colonial structures and enforce the exploitation of the nature?
I mean, what I'm strongly arguing for is a more historical thinking, and that means that while if you only look into the short history after 45, what I said, I mean, in the beginning, the former colonial powers, especially France and Great Britain, didn't even accept the respect, the political and civil rights of those countries who fought for their independence from colonialism. And then the colonial nation, the former colonial and then independent nations argued for a change of the world economic system, the Bandung process, and the request for a new economic world order. And that is a process which was never really followed and never really led into results. And that is something we have to refer to right now, that the decolonization process has been interrupted, and that goes mainly to the access to land, access to natural resources, control over natural resources, and also the conditions, the global conditions of trade, of the tax system, and so on. That has to be fundamentally at least reformed in order to finalize the process of decolonization.
Looking at the open questions that are in the questions and answers tool, the ones that have swum to the top, floated to the top by you, they're all addressed to you. And you can see them, and perhaps you take them in the order in which you like and give responses to them. And I expect that more questions will come to you, Wolfgang, as Bayo speaks, because usually questions are typed after the presentation is ended. So Bayo, perhaps you take the questions that are directed at you.
Okay, thanks, brother. I will try to. So let me just read this one out. The first one is, in this fugitive movement of the human from being central, sovereign, coherent, complete, to something else entirely that involves a blurring of boundaries, a different understanding of agency, embodiment. How do we relate? What is the role of the relational space? How does the way we meet each other and the world change? Let me put it this way, that it might involve turning to surprise, what I call a politics of surprise. But let me frame it by drawing a thread from some of the things that my brother Wolfgang said. So recently, Germany was in conversation with Namibia about reparations, basically paying Namibia for the genocide in 1904, in the first decade of the 20th century. 1.1 billion euros, I think, was the suggested amount. and Germany made a point to say that we're not paying you this money, we're just going to give you the funding to do some projects, right, that you can funnel to NGOs and development projects and stuff like that. And of course, it was met with laughter from the people concerned in Namibia. They said, that's not enough. Even though they added that maybe €1 trillion would be enough, their point was to say, this way of framing a response to this problem is too reductionistic to meet the moment, right? It's the same way a few years ago, the ocean was given, the global ocean, since we have just one ocean, never mind its partitions. The ocean was given a dollar amount, Andreas. It was $1 trillion. It's worth $1 trillion. Maybe in a decade, Elon Musk might be able to buy the ocean. And the idea was to keep people, this was legal, to keep people, cap and trade, you see, to keep people from pouring plastic into the ocean and contributing to its pollution. We're going to give the ocean a dollar amount. Do you see how the ways we respond to the crisis is the crisis? Just 2 days ago, I read about Denmark and one of its hugely popular projects of clearing some of its beaches by a tractor comes through and clears the beach. But then it pours the trash back into the water. And some of its policymakers are saying, that's stupid. That seems to be a microcosm of the ways we're responding writ large, that we can write laws. And I agree with my brother about we need laws, but there's an underbelly of those laws, right? That even with civil rights could, especially where I come from, and from my perspective, civil rights is increasingly, and civil rights actors are increasingly part of the architecture that we're trying to respond to, because it's the same algorithm of response. And so we're trapped in this epistemology. So to Amy's question, what does it look like relationally? I think it would take some kind of a disability, a collective disability, and that's not too far-fetched. We just went through one and we're still going through one, the pandemic. Almost significantly, you could frame it as an alien coming into the human and disrupting the ways we relate to each other. We were quarantined for months. I do not know of any human institution or religion that would have gotten billions of people into their homes. So I'm saying that it would take us rekindling new ways of relating with each other, the world, and what it means to be well, what it means to be in community. And these will come from disruption. I do not have so much faith that it will ride on the backs of new legislation, however ambitious those legislations are. I feel it will come from the more than human, and that we are at the risk of winning these wars against the powers that be, against giant corporations, only for us to demand the very same thing that reinforces our entrapment.
Let me jump to Wolfgang, who has the question by Tanya Mackenzie, which really is a very nice sequel to what you just said, Bayo.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, Bayo, thanks for pointing out to Namibia, which I think is a good example for everything you said, and also for a lot of what I've been saying. And that is, it is due to the ongoing struggle, especially of the Herero and Nama people, descendants of those who have been tortured or forced into exile by the German colonizers, that this question of, let's say, acknowledgement of the genocide, even talking about genocide, and the question of reparation is on the agenda of at least parts of the German society and parts of the political actors. So I share all your critique, and there is much more to criticize on this so-called government agreement. But on the other hand, let us not be cynical, because it's also, we also have to acknowledge that we came, compared to the situation 20 years ago, when nobody knew about the genocide, it's a step forward. And then that brings me to the next point, Bayo, and that is you have been, you say probably the answer for all of this doesn't lie in new law, but in a change of, change of our mindset, change of thinking. And I completely agree to you that might as well be a solution. But I mean, what I'm suggesting is that in order to give, let's say, indigenous people, who many of you voted as those who should have more influence, in order to give them more influence, you have to equip them with certain resources that they can also pronounce their claims on a global level, that they are present at international conferences like Glasgow, and that they are able to enforce their rights, that they're able to exercise their rights against the Bolsonaros and all these others who are basically destroying their lands. And in order to defend themselves, they would need also resources to carry out a pragmatic struggle, which should be a social, political, as well as a legal struggle. And we have to be in solidarity with them, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to defend themselves. And that may require new law, that may also require the application of existing law, but that is something that is not already enforced. That is something that needs to be thought through, and that needs to be put into reality. So that's the one thing. The other thing is the question of Tanya was, you mentioned reparation for past colonial exploits. However, the monies the West donates or gives in aids is intricately tied into a continuation of those countries. That's exactly true, and that was exactly the point Bayo made for the Namibian example. It's a kind of extended development aid and not a reparation. And it's what my friend Makau Mutwa said in reference to the Namibian example. He said, the questions, if the question on the table is, will the German, the way how the Germans tackle the colonial genocide in Namibia will be defined by the Germans respecting the Black Namibians as equal human beings. And that is the question in place. And that means that they have to participate on an eye level in this negotiation process, which hasn't been the case. It was only the governments. It was a government-to-government agreement. And it also means that reparations have to be real reparations. And those who receive the reparations must be, that must be the question, who pays to what, to whom, and what will then get done with the money must be carried out in a participatory process where those indigenous communities who were who have been the victims of the colonial genocide have the say. And so that's fairly different to what is on the table now. And so there is a lot more done in this regard. And so I'm not arguing to pay reparation in form of new development aid, where Western companies get paid by Western states to carry out development projects.
I'm just going to piggyback on that, brother, and say absolutely. Well, I never speak in absolute, so I wouldn't say absolutely, but you know what I mean. I definitely agree with you. We need laws, we need conventions, we need agreements, we need new coalitions, and we need to protect our people. We need to do all of that. However, maybe one can refer to Evo Morales in Bolivia and your laws of the rights of the mother and Pachamama, basically recognizing nature as having its own right. I'm saying that law just didn't sprout from ahistorical or neutral political processes. It came from a deep understanding, a deeper intelligence that nature is alive, right? So laws are secretions of archetypal patterns. They don't just float into space, right? So it's not just civil rights and laws that are at work here. I'm speaking about patterns. You know, patterns are the actors, not individuals. We're speaking about trauma. We're speaking about intergenerational processes. It's not even about people dying before we get a chance to do something concrete. It's that these ways of acting are ecological, and we pass them down, so to speak, to volatile arrangements that reinforces those ways of acting. So it's that, especially for me as a person from the so-called global South, laws seem to be specious arrangements. I understand their operations, but in the worlds that I come from, we seem to have an intelligence that laws, that in a way that reinforces that aphorism, laws are meant to be broken, that there are other fugitive arrangements that defeat the eliteness, the elitism behind those laws. Human rights have never appealed or addressed our needs as a people from the global South, or I can speak specifically as an African. It has never been. And even to call me to the table and say, sit at the table, I will see you at an eye level, we're equals here, is an obscuring of the powers, of other sources of power, of other invitations to participation that might not look like intelligence to modern arrangements, but I think is at the heart of what we need to address as modern citizens facing demise. Right. So this is for me the critical issue. It's not an absolute statement about no, we don't need laws. We do need laws. We need conventions, and we need those kinds of juridical systems. But at the same time, something supplementary wants to be seen. So in a sense, it's not even that there's something missing from the Euro-American machine. It's that something exceeds it, something it's flailing at, something it's grappling for. And these polls, these beautifully well-intentioned polls, they don't strike or even come close to meeting or understanding the voices that want to be heard at this time. I'll just stop there for now.
Great, Bayo. Let me sort of conclude at this point. You seem to agree, and I think the audience by vote in one of the polls agreed, that the voices and the thinking of indigenous peoples should have more influence over world affairs. When we look at where we have institutional recognition, legal institutional recognition of indigenous peoples, then we have that in the Arctic Council, where the indigenous peoples of the circumpolar north have a particular position vis-a-vis governments that doesn't exist in any other form of governance internationally. And then there is a little bit of recognition in some other very specific acts of international law and international agreements, like the Stockholm Protocol on chemicals. It's really rare that the government-determined international negotiations and the international law that was created by governments recognizes indigenous peoples. So I hear from both of you that this is something that ought to be changed, but is it enough? And Wolfgang, I've triggered a response from you. Wolfgang.
Yeah, I mean, there is an important UN declaration, and that's the UN Declaration for the Rights of the Indigenous People, which Germany only recently ratified. So there is more, and also indigenous people can invoke not only individual, but also collective rights. And that is being done by many groups, let's say in South Africa, in India, the right to food, the right to water, litigation is invoking collective rights. And a lot is about indigenous people. So there is already a lot where, you know, a lot of law which can be used by people, but the problem is that the main decisions are taken in the global economic and trade systems, and their human rights and rights of the indigenous people are only a footnote. So I mean, how can you invoke human rights in this strange settlement tribunals in Paris, where, you know, basically it's an in-house battle between groups of lawyers instead of public proceedings, legal proceedings, and political proceedings. So I think that is the importance. I see from the chat, you know, obviously there. How could I not agree with, we need to learn from indigenous people, we need to let them have their own agency. But their agency, amongst other things, is also to go into legal and political struggles against Western actors, and that includes Western states, that includes Western development agency, that includes Western corporations. So I think it goes together to develop a kind of attitude. We have to learn from them, and I agree to what Bayo had been saying. But it's also, we are sitting in Berlin, in London, in Amsterdam, or whatever. We're sitting in capitals of trade and capitals of economy. And so indigenous community also need our solidarity, our practical and material solidarity in these struggles. And that is something where we cannot let them alone. That they have chosen to use this fora to go into these struggles, and there needs our support. And so it doesn't come by chance that Joshua Castellino, whom I quoted and whose article I recommended, is currently the head of the director of minority rights in London. And these are mainly indigenous communities seeking to invoke their rights in legal procedures in their countries, in their regions, but also on the international level. And that is something that needs to be supported.
I'll say something to that, Andreas, if you, it's probably wise here to invoke or paraphrase the Zapatistas' wise saying that if you've come to solve my problem, then I don't want to be part of this conversation. But if you've come for us to be partners, then let's do this together. I'm paraphrasing this poorly, but there is a subtle note, and this is not cynicism, brother. This is I dare call it prophecy. And by prophecy, I don't mean prediction. I mean seeing differently and seeing from a definite, specific materiality, from a different perspective. That there seems to be this subtle pattern of inclusivity that has defined the ways that we frame Western relations to indigenous communities. It's about bringing them up to the table. It's about supporting them. And it's the danger of closure that voices like mine are enunciating. That, as for instance, as a psychologist, I was trained in Western psychology, and I studied traditional healers. And one of the conversations in Nigeria was how to bring more traditional healers to certifiable education systems. How do we give them certificates? How do we make them PhDs? How do we teach them how to be functional in clinical settings? You see, what that does in a way, it elides, it obscures and I know this might sound woo-woo to lots of people listening, but it elides the other relationalities, the other ways of being in power with the world that I cannot emphasize enough. It's at stake in our conversations about climate. Justice is just one rubric or heuristic with which we see this issue. If we see it as a problem of justice and the coherence and integrity of the public order, then what that loses is the sight that the public order itself is eroding the very structure that holds laws and conventions together is falling apart. Modern civilization is hollowing out. And our affective intensities, the way we feel about each other, the way we approach consumerism, the way we educate our children, the way we value elders, the way we treat the world around us, all of these questions are now up in the air, right? So this is at stake here. It's not, as much as I do want to emphasize and join you in calling for support, in asking that we diffractively meet each other, it has to be in a middle, not a geometric middle, but an algorithmic middle, where we're able to share with each other and say, listen, there are other ways of being in the world. Or we risk losing the playground in our attempts to centralize the table, the supposedly definite place of power, where the only agency is available.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, like, I didn't call for inclusion. That's definitely not a word I'm using. I use the word solidarity, and I refer to the political vision of international solidarity. And
yeah, that Wolfgang, just brief, that's why I said there's a subtle hint of inclusivity, not in what you're saying, but in how practices have unfolded historically.
Exactly, that's exactly what. Yes, exactly. That's and I see in the chat. I see now. If you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's exactly what I mean. So colonialism and a very connected phenomena of racism is also my problem, because I don't want to live in such a society. And so this is why your and mine liberation is bound together. And the other question, Ronnie Roberts, do we need to go to their table rather than invite them to ours? This is not a contradiction. I mean, it's exactly, it's your table is my table, and hopefully, hopefully your table is my table is your table. And that is—
Or let's go to a playground, like Rumi said. We're beyond right and wrong, and we'll meet each other there.
Exactly. But this is, and this is what I want to, this is what I'm insisting on. This is already happening since 1 or 2 decades in certain networks, in certain global networks, and it's a difficult exercise. I have to tell you, because we're not all equipped with the same resources and with the same accesses to public attention, to media, to material resources. And that doesn't hinder us to sit down and find out where not the geographical center is, or where the point of encounter is. And it needs an ongoing critical reflection. And what I'm thinking is, that is partly what I'm missing in this environmental discussion right now, because for me, the tone is, it has more of the savior than parts of the human rights scene have already overcome, due to the critique of people like Anthony Engi, Mako Mutwa, and others.
Yeah. Bayo, can I encourage you to look at the remaining questions in the question and answer and see what you want to address?
Okay. So the question by my sister, I dare say, Rama, and she asks about smaller economies and how these smaller economies can address climate justice. Let me say this, that a Palestinian activist and elder told me recently that the pandemic exposed the falsehood of the idea that the West, the stylized West, had it all together in terms of health, right? In terms of health response to the pandemic, not only in terms of building hospitals and all those infrastructure, but in something deeper, in the notion of hygiene, right? Hygiene and the ways that the West territorializes bodies away from environments, as against the ways that you might find children in Brazil or in India or in Nigeria playing on the streets, where germs are good. at the risk of romanticizing these issues, I just want to say that there is power even in abjection. And that is decolonization, that is decoloniality, beyond the ramifications and conversations between states and issues of reparations and payments and pasts. The idea of decoloniality, I think if it's really put to work, is that capture or abjection or exclusion is not entirely possible, or it is not fully realizable. That even within the slave ship, even in Auschwitz, even in the most horrible circumstances, there are sparks of agency. I do not live in those circumstances, and I cannot speak about them with broad brushstrokes, but I am driven to suspect that there is power there. Power may never be framed in the UN or in UNESCO or in giant international institutions as listening to an ancestor. But I think that there are ways of us communing with the world around us that calls out the idea that our work in this time is to save the world. And instead emphasizes that our work in this time is to re-entangle ourselves with a planet that has always exceeded the human, is to learn how to live and common in cracks, in spaces of rupture, right? So in those circumstances, I would invite us to slow down. That urgent times, instead of speeding up, they call for slowing down. They ask us to look at each other. I'm learning a lot from Palestinian communities with their technologies like mujawara, a form of neighboring under statelessness that allow them to flourish under abject conditions. Maybe that's the destiny that we're facing as a global community. We have to learn to meet each other again, is my point. Maybe that's the way I'll wrap that one up. Andreas, you want me to answer the next question? Do we have time for?
If you feel you can, it is a rather specific question about as a business designer in a company, what can I do as a business designer in a company to aid the process of decolonialization or think and act in the way of decolonialism?
Okay, so it's good. There are different terms, and meanings that are attached to this notion of decolonization. Decolonization is not a return to the past. It's not recovering an original image. It's about being aware of our social analytics and how we are often trapped in an image, not noticing that the image is spilling into an algorithm, right? So decolonization within a business organizational setting might look like coming around spaces of failure and asking what the failure wants to inject in how we see each other or how we operate with the world. I've seen something of that sort happening with UNESCO, where I do some consulting, where the very seditious and fugitive notion of futures literacy is turning the organization inside out, right? If it's allowed to do its work completely. I know there's a lot of politics there. But the issue is people are learning to revamp the notion that UNESCO is the organization that it purports to be. They're learning to rethink the future of education, the future. This is not about forecasting or futures analysis. It's about reanalyzing the present. I think decolonization really does its work well when it's allowed to invite us into a space that I call generative incapacitation. Those places of failure that we push under the Department of HR or we kind of don't bring to work. The issue is, how are we showing up in our places of assembly? What is allowed to show up? What is excluded from showing up? If we have spaces where we can invite the alterity of ourselves in, then we might meet strange things, have strange new questions and strange new practices. And maybe that's the point of it all, spilling away from the image and finding something new and novel.
Thank you. And I hope, Tana Miranga, that was a useful answer, not knowing exactly what sort of company you are working for.
Yeah.
That leaves only one question from Romany Roberts, who has also been very active in the chat, and it is directed to both of you. And perhaps you can weave that into a final statement. And Wolfgang,
Okay.
I'll invite you to go first. Does giving rights to indigenous people only still keep alive the terms in sort of Western way of thinking? Shouldn't we ask indigenous peoples what they would term their rights? Yes, if we as Western, as Northern countries, nations, corporations have taken things away, then it's not in our right to give them back. It is in their right to claim them back and to reinstate the rights that they have. Wouldn't you see it that way, Wolfgang, and then Bayo?
No, I don't.
I'll let Wolfgang go first.
I don't see it that way. I mean, they're entitled to these rights. I mean, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are born equal, free and equal in their dignity and also in rights. But the problem is, it's not about giving them rights. It's not about empowerment or whatever. It's basically the same problem we have with the justice system in all of our societies. If you belong to justice system is also often a class justice system. If you have if you belong to a lower class, if you don't have enough resources, you have difficulties. You have more difficulties to enforce your rights. And this is the kind of process I was talking about. It's about indigenous communities choosing they have their own. There is a huge toolbox, including political and social tools and struggles. But if you choose to use the legal proceedings, there are ways of what I'm saying, solidarity. And that is not giving, that is not empowering, that is something else. That is what we have been discussing in the slope before. That is coming together and leading certain cooperating, leading certain struggles together because it's in our common interest. And that has nothing to do with giving and empowering.
Bayo.
You probably know Fela Anikulapo Kuti, who is the father of Afrobeat. I don't know if anyone here has heard of this. He's a legend on the African music scene. Founded Afrobeat, like I said. One of his songs was about human rights and how they want to dash us. To dash is Nigerian street slang for to give in a dismissive way. So he says and sings, I'm not going to sing for y'all. They won't dash us human rights. Animal won't dash us human rights, which is that we're all, in a sense, we're saying we're all animals together and we've never been equal. I do have a sense in which I would articulate a dependency for survival under these circumstances as needing rights. But rights themselves are also fields of entitlements that are promulgated, reinforced and supported and undergirded by a particular social and cosmological arrangement, right? So rights do not just appear to us, we practice them into being. And my point again with this idea is that the very field that creates the room for those rights to exist is being haunted right now. And we need not only to speak about rights, but we need to speak about the things that rights often obscure in a conversation about climate change or well-being or thriving in communities. What a shaman told me is a sense of indebtedness, right? So it's not just a field of entitlement, it's the things that call upon us, the rituals, and by rituals, I don't mean voodoo stuff. I mean the everyday practices with which we create reality, even in modern establishments and modern situations, that we are being called to uphold or to reinforce or to experiment with new ways of creating the everyday. Sometimes the conversation about rights drives us back like sheep into a herding place where we're locked into a field of power. And I want to follow desire, using the framework of Deleuze. I want to follow desire out of that enclosure of power and go to other places of acting with the world. How do we do that? That's another keynote.
Thank you very much, Bayo. This was fabulous. You two were a moderator's dream, feeding on one another's ideas and spinning them forward and responding. This was great, in addition to all the material that came to you through the chat and through the questions and answers. Thank you to all of you in attendance and all of you participating and all of you behind the scenes who have made this possible with all the gimmicks that we used here today. I hope you found it lively, entertaining, and engaging. And I look forward to our next meeting. Until then, stay healthy, stay happy, and make somebody else happy. See you then.